I want to tell you about the afternoon a very proud man handed a shilling to the woman who owned half of Derbyshire, and how that single coin became the most expensive mistake he ever made, and the luckiest. It happened in September of 1822, on a grey Tuesday that smelled of wood smoke and coming rain, at a stone manor house called Wrenfield, which sat at the end of a long gravel road outside the village of Ashbourne. The house was not the grandest in the county. It was not meant to impress. It had thick walls and small windows and a kitchen garden so productive that the neighbours had spent 30 years wondering how the Calloway women did it, and never once receiving a straight answer. I should tell you a few things about Wrenfield before we go further, because a house like this one has a personality, and if you do not understand the house, you will not understand the woman. The estate had passed through 4 generations of Calloways, and in all that time it had never gone to a son, because there had never been a son to go to. The Calloways ran female, generation after generation, as if the land itself had opinions about who should tend it. The neighbours found this unsettling, the Calloway women found this perfectly sensible, and the current mistress of Wrenfield, Miss Maren Calloway, 29 years old, and tested by 6 years of unwanted suitors, found it the most natural thing in the world. Maren Calloway managed Wrenfield the way her mother had managed it, and her grandmother before that. She kept the accounts. She negotiated with the tenant farmers. She knew the name of every horse in the stable and every variety of apple in the orchard, and she could tell you, without consulting a ledger, exactly how many cords of wood would see the house through until April. She was not, in other words, a decorative creature. She was a working one. And on the Tuesday in question, she was in the kitchen garden. She was not there for her health, though the air was sharp and good. She was there because one of the cold frames had cracked in the night, and she was deciding whether it could be repaired before the temperature dropped, or whether the seedlings would have to be moved inside, and she had a trowel in one hand and a good deal of mud on her apron and absolutely no patience for the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She heard them anyway. She did not smooth her apron. She pushed her hair back from her face with her wrist, the way you do when your hands are dirty, and she looked over the low stone wall of the garden toward the front of the house, and she saw a travelling carriage, black and well-sprung, and behind it a second vehicle carrying luggage. She had seen men arrive at Wrenfield before. She knew the type on sight she knew the type on sight, the way you come to know. This one was tall. 35 perhaps, or near enough. Dark coat, good boots, the particular cuffing of posture said he had grown up, being told he was important and had never once been given reason to doubt it. He looked at the house the way men like him always looked at things they were considering acquiring, taking inventory, tallying worth. She felt the old familiar tiredness settle through her like cold water. Another one, she thought, another smooth, well-mounted gentleman come to look at the ledgers and the land and call it courtship. Her cousin Philippa had written to warn her. The Viscount Pemberly had expressed interest, Philippa had said. The Viscount Pemberly was a perfectly respectable man, Philippa had said. He had a title and a seat in Northumberland and debts that were, according to Philippa, not unreasonable for a man of his station, which meant, Maren had understood, that they were large enough to matter and small enough to hide for the first 2 months of a marriage. She had not written back with any enthusiasm. Now she watched the Viscount Pemberly. For that is who it was, I can tell you, though Maren had no way to know it yet. Look at her house with his calculating eyes. And she thought about going inside and changing her dress and presenting herself in the drawing-room and going through it all again, the tea and the pleasantries and the studied compliments and the careful questions about the yield on the south fields, and she was so thoroughly tired of it that she did something she had never done before. She stayed where she was. She pulled her hat down a little further over her face. She picked up her trowel, and when the man came around the corner of the house and saw her kneeling in the mud and stopped, She looked up at him with precisely the expression of a woman interrupted in the middle of important work. He looked at her the way men of his kind look at servants, not unkindly, particularly, but with the specific vacancy of someone who has already filed you under not relevant and moved on to the next thought. "You there," he said. "Is the mistress of the house receiving?" Maren looked at him for a moment. The sensible thing, obviously, was to stand up and say, "I am the mistress of the house." Any reasonable person would have done exactly that. But Maren Calloway had been reasonable for 29 years, and it had gotten her 6 years of fortune hunters. And so instead she said, in the flat tone of someone with better things to do, "She may be." The man, Lord Pemberly, Viscount, Northumberland, debts not unreasonable for a man of his station, looked at her for another moment, and then reached into his coat pocket and produced a coin, which he held out to her with the ease of someone who did this sort of thing regularly. "Be a good girl and let her know Lord Pemberly has arrived." I wrote ahead. Maren looked at the coin. She looked at his face. She took the coin because if she had refused it, he would have known immediately that something was wrong, and she was not ready for him to know that yet. She wasn't entirely sure what she was ready for. She just knew she was not going back into the drawing room to be evaluated like a piece of property. She tucked the coin into her apron pocket. She picked up her trowel again. "I'll pass the word along," she said, and went back to examining the cracked cold frame. She heard him go around to the front door. She heard Miss Hewitt, who had been her housekeeper for 15 years and had the poker face of a diplomat, greet him in the hall and explain that Miss Calloway was expected shortly. Would he care to wait in the parlour? She heard the door close. She sat back on her heels in the mud and thought, "What in the world am I doing?" She did not have a good answer, but she also did not go inside. What she did instead was put the seedlings in the lean-to behind the stable, because the cold frame was beyond immediate repair and those seedlings were not going to tend themselves. And when that was done, she went to the pump at the side of the kitchen garden and washed her hands and her face, and then she stood there for a moment, dripping, and thought about what happened next. There was a small wooden bench against the garden wall, worn smooth by decades of use. She sat on it. She was still sitting there when Lord Pemberly came around the corner again. He stopped when he saw her. Then, apparently deciding she was still less important than his errand, he said, "Has the girl passed along my message? I've been waiting the better part of an hour." "Mrs. Hewitt explained the situation, I believe," Maren said. "She said Miss Calloway was about the property somewhere." That was 40 minutes ago. He looked genuinely irritated, which she found interesting. A man who had come to make a good impression would have disguised the irritation better. This suggested either that he had no particular concern about making a good impression, or that he had not yet classified this conversation as one that required it. "Is she always so?" He gestured vaguely. "Elusive." "She has a great deal to manage," Maren said. He made a sound that was not quite a scoff. He looked out across the kitchen garden at the cold frames and the espaliered pear trees and the tidy beds of late-season vegetables, and something in his expression shifted. "This is well kept," he said, a little grudgingly. "Yes. She manages it herself. No steward. She prefers to keep her own counsel on the land." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the opposite end of the bench. Not close, nothing improper, just the action of a man who was tired of standing. He rubbed the back of his neck, and for a moment he looked less like a viscount and more like a person. "I don't suppose," he said, "that you know much about what she's like. Miss Calloway." Maren considered this. "Some, is she?" He stopped, started again. "I have been told she is sensible." "She is, and the house is as described it is. And the income from the tenant farms is reliable." "Very," he nodded slowly. He was looking at the pear trees. They were old trees, beautifully trained, probably planted by Maren's grandmother, and they were the kind of thing that took decades of patient attention to produce, and you could tell a great deal about a household from whether its old trees had been tended or neglected. "I came," he said, "because I was told I ought to." Maren said nothing. "My situation is—" He stopped again. She waited. There was something working in his face, some internal argument she was not privy to. "My estate in Northumberland is solvent," he said, "but it requires investment I cannot make on my own. I have been advised that a practical marriage is the reasonable solution. I have been told Miss Calloway is practical, she is, and yet here I am, talking to the hired help, because the practical woman is nowhere to be found." He did not say it cruelly. He said it with a kind of exhausted wryness that Maren, despite everything, found unexpectedly human. She looked at him. He was not what she had expected. Or rather, he was exactly what she had expected on the surface, and underneath there was something that did not quite fit the surface, something worn and not entirely comfortable with itself. He had good eyes, she noticed. A little too honest for the rest of his performance. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked mildly surprised to be addressed directly, but he said, "I suppose. The investment your estate requires, what would it be for? The land? The tenants? The house itself?" He turned to look at her properly for the first time. He was reassessing something, she could see it, but he had not landed on the right answer yet. "The drainage on the north fields," he said after a moment. "It's been failing for a decade. And the roof on the home farm, and the schoolhouse for the tenants' children, which has been in a disgraceful state since before I inherited. In that order. What? Would you address them in that order? Drainage, roof, schoolhouse?" He stared at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "The drainage affects yield, which affects income, which is what makes the other two possible. You start with the foundation. And yet the schoolhouse bothers you most." He was very quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I didn't say that." "No," Maren agreed. "You didn't." A silence settled between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. A sparrow landed on the garden wall, considered them both, and flew away. "You're very forthcoming for a—" He gestured vaguely at her again. "For a hired girl. I was going to say for someone I've just met. Am I? I apologize." "Don't," he said, and the word came out with something genuine in it, something that surprised even him, she thought. He looked back at the pear trees. "I have not spoken plainly to anyone in," he shook his head. "It doesn't matter. It might," Maren said quietly. He glanced at her. Then, as if deciding she was of no consequence, and therefore perfectly safe to be honest with, because what could it cost a man to tell the truth to a woman with mud on her apron, who held no power over him whatsoever? He said, "I am tired of performing. I have been performing since I was 16 years old, and I would like very much to simply be a man who has a problem and is trying to solve it. But every room I walk into requires a performance, and this house and this situation are no different, and I am so damned tired of it that I sat on a garden bench and talked to a stranger for 20 minutes, rather than go back inside and wait in that parlor with my hat in my hands." Maren was quiet for a moment. "That seems honest," she finally said. "It is honest." He seemed faintly appalled at himself. "Don't repeat it." "To whom would I repeat it?" He laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as if he had not expected to do it. It changed his face entirely. "Fair point," he said. She was aware of several things simultaneously. She was aware that she had now been sitting on a garden bench talking to this man for the better part of an hour, and Mrs. Hewitt was somewhere inside the house, almost certainly having the time of her life. She was aware that she still had his shilling in her apron pocket. She was aware that at some point, probably soon, this situation was going to resolve itself. And when it did, she was going to have to contend with his reaction, which would almost certainly be unpleasant. She was also aware that she had not been this interested in a conversation in longer than she could easily remember. "What is the schoolhouse like?" she asked. He told her. He told her about the leaking roof and the broken desks, and the teacher, a young man named Mr. Fenn, who had been hired fresh out of Oxford, and who was, according to Lord Pemberly, entirely too good for what I've given him to work with. He told her about the farmers on his north fields, whose names he knew, all of them, and the particular irrigation problem in the lowest corner where the clay ran too close to the surface. He talked about Northumberland the way you talk about a place you are responsible for and cannot quite bear to let down. She asked questions, he answered them. He asked questions back. About the kitchen garden, about the espaliered pears, about the cold frame she had been repairing when he arrived, about the drainage on Wrenfield's own south slope, which he had noticed on the road in. She answered him straight, without performing, because she had stopped performing approximately 45 minutes ago and had found the experience entirely too refreshing to give up. The light shifted. The afternoon began to grey toward evening, and then Mrs. Hewitt appeared at the corner of the kitchen garden, and she said, with a diplomacy that Maren could only admire, "My lord, I wonder if you might like to come inside for tea. Miss Calloway is," she paused with perfect precision, "available now." Lord Pemberly stood. He looked at Mrs. Hewitt. He looked at Maren. Something changed in his face. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a very quiet thing, the shift that happens when two pieces of information that have been sitting separately in a man's mind suddenly arrive at the same address. He looked at her apron. He looked at her hands, which were clean now but still roughened from work. He looked at the trowel she had set on the bench beside her. He looked back at her face, and she watched him understand. The silence that followed was approximately the length of a very long breath. "Miss Calloway," he said, "not a question." "Lord Pemberly," she said, "not an apology." He looked away. He looked at the pear trees. He was doing something internal and private, and she let him do it, because she had just spent an hour sitting with this man on a garden bench, and she had learned, among other things, that he needed a moment when something surprised him. Then he put his hand in his coat pocket and produced a coin. He held it out to her, and she recognized it. Because she had given it to Mrs. Hewitt when she came inside to wash her hands. And she supposed Mrs. Hewitt had returned it to him inside, which was exactly the kind of mischief she should have expected from Mrs. Hewitt. "I believe," he said, "that this is yours." She looked at the coin. She looked at his face. His expression was complex. There was anger in it, yes, and embarrassment, which she had expected, but there was also something else, something she had not entirely anticipated, which was the particular expression of a man who has just realized he has been hoisted by his own petard and cannot, in all fairness, complain about it. "I couldn't very well correct you in front of the gate," she said. "You'd already made your opinion clear. I'd been riding since dawn. I've been in the garden since 6 o'clock morning. That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "I was rude to you. You were. I gave you a shilling. You did. And you—" He stopped again. A muscle worked in his jaw. "And you are the woman I came to propose to. That was my understanding." Another silence. He was still holding out the coin, and she had not taken it. After a moment, he put it back in his pocket. "You might have said something," he said, and there was real injury in it which she had expected, and also real uncertainty which she had not. "You might have looked," she said, not unkindly. He flinched. Just slightly. She gave him credit for not pretending he hadn't. "You know," he said, after a moment, "I told you things out here, yes. Things I would not have said to Miss Calloway, yes. Because I thought you were. Of no consequence," she said. "No one who mattered. Someone it cost nothing to be honest with." He was quiet. "Lord Pemberly," she said. And she kept her voice steady, because she had spent 29 years keeping her voice steady, and she was very good at it. "I have had 6 years of men coming to this house and performing for Miss Calloway and saying all the right things and leaving me with absolutely no idea what they were actually like. I have had proposals from men I knew nothing about because they were too busy being impressive to be real." She looked at him. "I know more about you from 1 hour on this bench than I have ever known about any man who came to Wrenfield with his intentions. I know what you actually worry about at 3 in the morning. I know how you think through a problem. I know you are embarrassed about the schoolhouse and that you shouldn't be, because being embarrassed about it means you care, and men who care about a leaking schoolhouse in a village where no one of consequence will ever notice are not so common as you might think." He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. "That does not," he said, slowly, "entirely excuse." "It doesn't excuse anything," she agreed. "I behaved improperly, and I should have corrected you immediately, and I didn't, and I know that. But I am not sorry I know what I know. And I would like you to consider, before you decide to be angry, that you came here to propose to a woman you knew nothing about except that her income was reliable, and the only reason you know anything real about her now is because you thought she wasn't worth lying to. The light was going. Somewhere in the house, a lamp was being lit, and the warm glow of it appeared in one of the downstairs windows. Lord Pemberly looked at her for a long moment. "The coin was for your trouble," he said finally. "Keep it," she said. "Put it toward the schoolhouse roof." He looked down. She thought for a moment that he might smile. He did not quite, but it was close. "I need to think," he said. "Of course. I need to, yes." He looked at the house. He looked at her. "Will you come inside, Miss Calloway, for tea? Whatever comes after that, you deserve tea at the very least after sitting in the cold." "I've been in worse cold," she said. Nevertheless, she stood. She was slightly stiff from the bench, and she did not pretend otherwise. He did not offer his arm, and she did not expect him to. They were past the performance of those gestures, for better or worse. They walked back to the house side by side, and Mrs. Hewitt was waiting at the door with an expression of absolute serenity that Maren was going to have words with her about later. "I should tell you, before I go further, that this is the moment the story turned. Not the coin, and not the revelation. Those were only facts. The turn was the walk. The turn was two people who had already spent an hour being honest with each other, walking toward a house to decide what to do about it. They had tea, and the unmistakable air of a woman. Then they had a conversation that lasted past dinner and into the evening. Because once you have told someone the truth about the schoolhouse roof and the drainage on the North Fields, and the particular brand of loneliness that comes with being responsible for other people's lives, it is very difficult to go back to performing. Lord Pemberly, Marcus, his name was, though it took another 2 weeks before she used it, did not propose that evening. He asked instead if he might return in a fortnight, not to continue the original errand exactly, but to see the south drainage that she had mentioned, because he was curious. About the drainage, she told him she would be in the garden. He came back in 11 days. He brought, in his saddlebag, a set of engineering drawings for a drainage system that bore a suspicious resemblance to the problem she had described, which meant he had been thinking about it since he left. And if you know anything about what it means when a man thinks about a woman's drainage problem for 11 days, then I do not need to explain the rest to you. He was in the stable yard when he arrived, because he had come earlier than expected, and Maren was there, because she had been there since 7 in the morning. He came around the corner of the stable with his engineering drawings under his arm, and found her in her working clothes, with her hair loose under a battered hat, and he stopped, and he looked at her, and he said, "Good morning, Miss Calloway," in a voice that suggested he had found exactly who he was looking for. She said, "You're early," he said. "I know." And she said, "Good." They married in January, in the church at Ashbourne, which was small and cold and full of people from the village who had known Maren since she was born and who had strong opinions about who was worthy of her. The tenants from his Northumberland estate made the journey south, which no one had expected, but which Marcus had apparently mentioned in a letter and which they had apparently decided was worth a 3-day trip in winter. The schoolhouse was repaired in March, before the ground had fully thawed, because that was the order Marcus had given, and he was a man who meant what he said about priorities. And if you asked Maren, years later, what she remembered most about the afternoon a proud man arrived at Wrenfield and handed a shilling to the woman who owned it, she would tell you about the pear trees and the bench, and the particular quality of his voice when he said, "I am tired of performing." Before he knew it cost him anything to say it, to her of all people, the woman who owned the house, who was worth nothing, who was of no consequence, who turned out, as these things sometimes do, to be the only thing that mattered. The shilling, by the way, never made it to the schoolhouse roof. It sits on the mantelpiece at Wrenfield next to a small clay pot, that Maren made in the kitchen garden the spring after they married, lopsided and impractical, and entirely her own. She finds it funnier every single year, and if you have sat with me through all of that, through the cold frame and the garden bench and the long walk back to the house, then I am glad you were here, and I will not pretend I could have told it without you. If this is your first time by this fire, consider staying. We have more stories where this one came from, and I promise you, not one of them goes the way you expect.